About halfway through my time with Dragon's Dogma 2, I was approached by two men who each wanted me to find the jadeite orb for them.
Might not one of the bandits in Vernworth's jail know of the methods employed by thieves and their ilk?
I followed the prompting of my support pawn, who knew that I needed to talk to an imprisoned thief nearby to get the orb's location. Once I'd acquired the orb, I brought it back to town, but before choosing a buyer, I hatched a cunning plan.
I've got a plan so cunning you could put a tail on it and call it a weasel.
I remembered that the first game let you create forgeries that could pass as the real thing, so I had another jadeite orb made and promptly sold the fake and the original to both buyers to get double rewards. Now, these are what the kids call Dragon's Dogma moments, these emergent, intuitive little secrets. But this example is important not just because it's one of the few instances of ingenuity in Dragon's Dogma 2, but it's a perfect metaphor for the experience that Hideaki Itsuno and Capcom sold me. A forgery that could pass as the original, but upon closer inspection, is far less special than the genuine article. So, tough talk, right? Well, let's back it up. I didn't expect this to be the tone that I took with my review of Dragon's Dogma 2, which I'll call DD2 from here on out to preserve oxygen. I recently extolled the virtues of the original game, flaws and all. It was a charming, earnest, and daring game that had a lot of the easy pleasures of action games and RPGs without always having either of their depth, which at the time Hideaki Itsuno excused away as budget constraints and creative interference by Capcom, as well as just his preferred recipe of game making. I read Mr. Itsuno loud and clear. No harm, no foul, game still good. But now that we have the sequel in our hands over a decade later, I'm amazed at how little Itsuno and company saw fit to improve, and yet Itsuno claims it's exactly the game he always envisioned Dragon's Dogma to be. So what's the disconnect? Am I simply misunderstanding his genius, or is he overestimating just how good DD2 actually is? I'll be frank about my frustrations here, but hopefully fair. So let's get into answering that question. Let's start with the story hook. Makoto Ikehara helped build the world's rules and lore as a consultant early on in the original Dragon's Dogma's development, but he's actually become the lead writer here in DD2, joining returning scenario writer Haruo Murata from the first game. This seemed like a match made in heaven since the first game had its moments and a great ending. But unfortunately, outside of one cool set piece and some decent side quests, so much of DD2's writing feels sort of uncommitted, half-hearted. The story missions especially. And it's not so much the dialogue as it is the situations and whether the drama is being earned. You do so many menial tasks in the main story before one set piece and boom, the game basically puts you in the endgame situation already. It's admittedly a cool subversive take in the endgame that adds a new dimension to the lore, but it whiffs the execution and really just feels like it's as phoned in as the rest of the story. And it's too bad because the game does start off strongly. Much like the first game, a dragon attacks and you rise to the occasion but are promptly defeated, your heart being plucked out and eaten by the dragon. But you don't die, and are instead invited by the dragon to come retrieve your heart. You are now what's known as an Arisen, a champion destined to defeat the dragon once tied to it in this way. In the world of Vermund, where the game is set, the Arisen is chosen as the sovereign, the ruler of the land, but this comes in a time when acting Queen Regent Disa had outlived the other members of the ruling class and was set to make her son Sven the sovereign. She conspires to have you cursed so that you lose your memory of being Arisen and supplants you with an imposter until her son can take the throne. You're then sent to toil in a pawn labor camp, blissfully unaware of your true calling, until one day, a Medusa runs rampant in the camp and gives you an opportunity to escape with the help of a mysterious stranger who seems to know about your destiny. The much-loved healer pawn Rook from the first game reappears to help you escape on the back of a griffin, and you make it back to civilization. We quickly come into contact with Sir Brant, the captain of the Royal Guard, who informs you that he knows you've been wrongfully usurped, and he works to set about helping you uncover the web of conspiracy and reclaim your throne, realizing that this is all part of a much bigger scheme to undo the cycle of dragon versus Arisen. To say more would be to ruin nearly everything since it's actually not that complex of a story and is extremely short by RPG standards, so we'll just leave it at that until the spoiler section.
Best go elsewhere, friend. There's no business to be had here. That's for sure.
But that's the general impetus you need to go out into the world and speak with folks and soak in the culture and go about adventuring. Several side quest chains you'll run into are pretty clever and link together in interesting ways that feel organic. One of Sir Brant's quests has you breaking out a magistrate from jail who's become so accustomed to reading his law books in peace that he won't leave until you can provide him a similar accommodation out in the regular world. The quest stalls out until you go a little farther into town and find a missing boy in the slums who happens upon an ancient library housed beneath the city. Unlike some Dragon's Dogma quests that just sort of maroon you and don't give you any indication of where to go next, this one leaves just enough time and room for you to explore and inquire around the world without hiding the answer in a haystack, and it feels all the more organic and satisfying as a result when you help out Sir Brant by getting this guy out of his comfort zone and into this ancient library where he'll be satisfied. In another quest line, a homeless young orphan girl looks just like a young noble up in the royal quarter, and he asks her to take his place in public life for one day so he can take a much-needed break and journey away from the public eye for a time. But this journey can go south if you don't properly supply him with health and advice to get him home safely, and if he dies, the young orphan girl is stuck in his place forever. It's a tragic, conflicting kind of tale in that she's safe from poverty and neglect, but she's also without her friends at the Abbey, stuck in a life that the boy desperately wanted a break from. It's too bad that there aren't more quests like this that tug at the heartstrings. One particularly good microcosm of DD2's weird quest design involves the quest lines related to the bow-wielding woman on the game's cover, Ulrika. She's actually the person you helped save during the dragon attack that made you arisen in the first place, and she's also the one who nursed you back to health to repay your kindness. But despite how important this should make her to the overall narrative, her quest lines are pretty undercooked. You help her fend off a dragon very briefly before it flies away, and then you're given a string of annoyingly vague objectives like come back from time to time to see if she's at her village, or even search the whole map for her once she disappears without any in-game clues as to her location. Once you do find her, you drive back a couple weeks Saurian invasions from her village, and voila, she's made chief of the village. And that's the last I heard of her, though supposedly there's a romantic send-off quest or two afterwards, but they didn't show up for me or were so awkwardly timing-based that it was easy to get missed. She's just not a terribly compelling personality, and her whole arc to chieftain feels rushed and kind of like small potatoes to get her there, especially since her reward is almost entirely owed to you anyway. It's kind of easy to start seeing that the people in this game are mostly figureheads, not characters with arcs. The scenario writing's uneven, sure, but the delivery is what doesn't do a good enough job of smoothing out this awkwardness. The voice acting is passable enough, and it uses the old English phrasing that was so fun in the original. Though weirdly, there's not a single accent other than English and American in the game, despite the original having French and African ones, which felt a lot more akin to the melting pot of the medieval era or the Crusade era. Considering there's numerous peoples here, including the new elf and beastren races, this just seems like a missed opportunity to add some personality. Even more boringly, the character models don't even lip sync with dialogue unless there's a story cutscene, and sometimes not even then.
This is the second time I've watched over you like this.
Characters just kind of stand there with their arms crossed or hands on hip, dryly delivering dialogue to contextualize quests in a Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Valhalla kind of way. Utterly serviceable, but it's always just so forgettable.
Suffice to say, your testimony, combined with the evidence you've procured, have cast a great deal of suspicion upon...
Now, the music by Monster Hunter Rise and RE7 composer Satoshi Hori fares a bit better, but this still feels like it belongs to a different, more conventional fantasy series. Dragon's Dogma had this great anime-like soundtrack that mixed pop rock and orchestral music together in this earnest, cheesy, and sometimes very beautiful blend, and outside of the ending credits theme here, the music is mostly just standard fantasy fare. The menu theme's strong, no doubt, and the character creator music is fine, but they don't have that spark to them, that interesting instrumentation or liveliness that their corresponding aspects did in the original game. The lute that plays as you travel is very pleasant to listen to, but it made me sad when it would play out a couple notes of Eternal Return from the first game and then not finish the musical phrase, or when it would use the Imminent Triumph song during combat but play the climactic choral chants when bosses are down to their last health bar, not when they were defeated like the original did, which added a satisfying sonic finality to fights. Like much of DD2, the music is in and of itself certainly fine, but in the context of this series, it feels extremely safe, and sometimes, like the ending theme, totally overwrought for how weak of an ending this game has. The visuals are a bit of a mixed bag too. The character creator can put out some really great looking models, I'll admit. I'm impressed that the black people and the old people look so lifelike, so well done, which is something that so many games fail to properly pay attention to. But the average NPC looks surprisingly bland or asset flippy, and their aforementioned lack of lip syncing makes them look even more cheap. It's funny that people have created way better looking models using Capcom's character creator than Capcom seems willing to make themselves in-game. And speaking of Capcom, they roll out their patented RE engine here for its first open world spin, and environmentally speaking, the engine does a pretty decent job. The level of detail, like the craggy mountains and lush grass, are worth the price of admission, and the differing levels of elevation really make you take the space seriously from a traversal standpoint. Particle effects are stunning as hurricanes and blizzards and firestorms rain down on foes, but you'll quickly realize that despite the fidelity and sometimes decent art design, the areas are really just kind of dioramas for trash mob fights and occasional mini-boss fights. They're as MMO light as the first game's area were, but with more annoying steps to get through. The colors can look rich, but they're spread out for too long over too much space, so that things start to look almost procedurally generated and samey after a while. Some areas, like the coast of Harv, have incredible color contrast between the blue-green of the sea and the rocky crags tufted with grass, all surrounded by large red mountains. But unless you're throwing spells around, like this light spell at night, the world can look kind of washed out and dim, even in the daytime. There's just green and gray in Vermund, orange and tan in Batal, and far too many parts of the day that just look overcast and lacking saturation. There's a kind of boring realism, honestly, that neither fits the tone of the series nor does it do it any favors artistically speaking. Even the menus, while sporting some stylish flourishes, are kind of dingy and dark and repel the eye a little bit, not to mention they're just as messy and awkwardly categorized as the original games were. Many of the boss monsters are just some variant of black, gray, or dark green, obscuring their otherwise very cool-looking models that are full of scars and dirt and other minutiae. DD2 often looks like kind of a weird-looking skin job of the original game, but with more fall damage. So let's take a look at the world design to see what I mean. Itsuno said the game is roughly 4 times as big as the original, but it doesn't feel like it. Maybe that's because your foot speed is faster than it was in the first game, so you don't have to sprint as much. Though I'm still very annoyed that Itsuno said its stamina wouldn't drain outside of combat, and it very much still does. Some stretches make you constantly pause and wait for it to recharge, just like the original game. The new Oxcart fast travel system isn't nearly as dynamic as Itsuno promised, where griffins would supposedly attack your cart while traveling in search of the oxen, but it does reduce a good amount of the tedium of travel here, and it's a welcome addition. And that's fortunate too, because your foot travel will reveal how empty the map really is. Just like the first game, DD2 is set up kind of like an MMO with trash mobs, every 50 feet or so, and an occasional mini-boss lurking in the wings. But when you're not clubbing hapless monsters, you'll be finding item chests out in the wild, and then going into side caves for, you guessed it, more chests. Outside of a couple of these caves, most are just populated with random health items and materials, and all the best loot is found in vendors just like it was in the first game. Itsuno said that the key to good exploration is to be in a place where your destination is within sight and not too far away, yet you feel excited about the path there. But there is very little out in the wilds that promises or delivers anything but yet another skirmish and some awful loot. The terrain's gradation and very specific paths over and around bodies of water makes you engage with it and think about the logic of the space, but the sheer number of rivers and such that make it to where you can't just get across something 20 feet across the way unless you take the long way around, very specific path down the river, just gets really old. This is made especially so when you slide off almost every decline and far fewer things than ever can be grabbed onto versus the last game, meaning you don't have nearly the freedom or the options available to find your own path intuitively. The world just feels like a big facade that you can't really interact with the same way you could before, the more you futz about. Now, the addition of campsites is a welcome one. Instead of having to return all the way to civilization every time you need to resupply or rest, campsites are sprinkled around judiciously and require a camping kit to rest till morning or nightfall and change out skills if you like. Just know that you can be attacked while resting and your camping kit can be destroyed, so always carry around 2 with you. Now, if you successfully rest at a campsite, you'll regain all your health and stamina and be right as rain. And what's so important about this is not only the immersion factor of feeling like you're out in the elements adventuring and surviving and keeping up the daily grind, but this, in addition to sleeping at inns, is the only way to restore your health back up to full. Remember how in the first game your health bar would cap at lower and lower thresholds as you took heavy damage, and you could only be restored to the full amount by using health curatives? Well, that's no longer a thing in DD2. Curatives can only heal up to whatever threshold you're at, and that's why resting at campsites and inns is so important and emphasized. There's also this weird mechanic where you've got a split second to essentially revive yourself. If your health bar hits 0, you can pop a health restorative to keep you alive as long as you do so within like a 1 to 2 second window. Now, what kind of sucks about all this is how much more aggressive enemies are now, and the fact that most vocations can't dodge, and the jump is now so worthless that it can't be used as a defensive measure for most vocations. Itsuno said in his IGN interview that while dodging is a big part of his Devil May Cry games, he thought it made more role-playing sense for very few vocations to have access to it, because that's something that makes less sense believably speaking versus, say, blocking an attack. Now, I get this point in theory, from a balance perspective, but it has to in practice be just as good as the theory, meaning that your game has to accommodate not being able to dodge and still have a way for your characters to stay alive. For instance, the Spear Hand gets this very short invincibility force field ability. The archer naturally has to stay back a ways and can kick away an enemy to make some space. There are plenty of times when the game's idea is to, you can't dodge, so use this ability to make up for it. Doesn't matter if you're getting utterly swarmed by the hyper-aggressive enemies in such a way that there's no way to escape constant knockdown and stagger states. So I initially started off as a mage, thinking I could unlock Sorcerer next, just like the last game. This was bad for two reasons. For one, Vocations don't unlock at predetermined levels anymore. They're learned from Maesters of the Vocation, whom you can also learn hyper-powerful Maester skills from if their affinity for you is high enough. The second reason to not be a mage is because they suck for how this game plays. They're far too passive and are more suited to being controlled by pawn AI, since that's one of the few things they do right in this game anyway, and the wind-up on offensive spells is way too long for how fast and aggressive enemies are who have moved out of the way already of your spell by the time it goes off, or kills you before it's had time to charge. So I quickly switched over to Thief, which I was told was the best class. They're hyper fast and scale beast really well, and they have an actual dodge move, praise the Lord. Thief was a lot of fun, as there's a really funny exploit where you can put on the dodge all damage move Formless Feint and then pop the self-immolation ability called Blades of the Pyre to negate all that damage and then just do extra damage. But as cheesy as that was, I really wanted to be a Spear Hand, as the pre-release footage for it really impressed me. Now this class is fine, and the shield is one of the best abilities in the game, but I can't say this class, like the Archer or Thief, actually had many other game-changing abilities and seemed to be more like a flavor of play than an actually defining, interesting set of rules to consider. I do think this game desperately needs to tone down the looseness that's supposedly there to encourage, emergent things to happen, but often just makes combat feel sloppy. I'm talking mostly about the lock-on feature. Itsuno said in his IGN interview that ideally for me, a game doesn't need lock-on. In a perfect world, players can't choose who to lock onto with the controls, and instead the game decides who the player locks onto on its own. What? Auto-aim is a perfect world to you versus being able to switch between opponents or true up animations or input lag by keeping my focus trained on my opponent Dark Souls style? The auto-aim, works fine for the archer, but if you're trying to use the Thief's ensnare ability to pull enemies down to the ground, a good 60% of the time the grapple just shoots out at nothing in particular. I covet the lock-on because I was constantly having to swing wildly to kind of catch up to guys who were on the outskirts of a fight, and then swing the camera right back as they went past me and went back into the fray the other direction. It's just kind of goofy and doesn't play well for a lot of the melee classes that you can't really pinpoint move towards enemies. The Spear Hand especially is such a lug, and it makes you feel like you had to get the drop on every enemy in a fight and just never let up and let them recover, because you're essentially going to be caught in a maelstrom of stagger states and can't recover yourself. The camera's sluggish enough on the ground, but it goes absolutely haywire if you're climbing on an enemy to get to their weak spots, which is pretty fucking important for nearly every mini-boss and the in-game bosses especially, which are designed to have their bottom halves almost completely invincible, requiring you to climb them. Now, Itsuno and company have added a great new feature in that you can release your hold on an enemy you're grabbing and rest on their body if it's a flat plane like their shoulder or a back and regain stamina. But it's rare for classes other than the Speedy Thief to get this opportunity because enemies thrash around constantly, either doing defensive maneuvers, stomp attacks, or trying to dislodge you from their back. The camera just can't keep up with all this movement and often makes you start going the wrong way if you've been climbing and the camera orientation changes abruptly. I've seen my guy just grab and lean on an enemy instead of climbing them if the command didn't go through right. Your stamina will still drain though, even if you're just leaning on this guy. It's just so goofy. And because there are so many particle effects going on and a minimum of 5 actors in every fight, the ground gets visually clogged up very fast and makes it incredibly hard to see what's going on, especially if you're a non-thief who doesn't have the ability to spam dodge to get free of the commotion. The biggest pain is that even when I was playing the Spear Hand and spamming the shield ability, it only lasts a couple of seconds. seconds, so I had to keep popping it back on to keep from getting killed, but could hardly ever tell when it was on and off or when it was just a highlight from another person's spell that was happening, leading to some really goofy, awkward deaths where I thought I was safe and the shield wasn't up at all. And when I could see, I was still fighting the incredible amount of input lag in the floaty controls. General jogging and running movement is actually really pleasant feeling to control on the Xbox Series X I played on, even more so than Dragon's Dogma just a couple months ago when I was making that video. But unlike that game, DD2 is super finicky about responding to your button presses. I had so many times where my spear hand just wouldn't pop his shield off or wouldn't grab a hold of an enemy when I clicked grab, even if I held it down. And it's easy to overclick the input because you're so used to it disobeying, so if your guy does grab hold, you can often unintentionally release your hold by clicking again, thinking you were just prompting the initial grab in the first place. The input lag got so bad at certain points that my guy just stopped moving, period, and wouldn't respond to any inputs. Again, the Thief had this problem less just because they're so much faster they don't run into as many goofy problems. But man, when you stress the engine to its limits, the Spearhand will show you a lot of the cracks in it. Now, as for the enemies themselves, you get most of the last game's roster with some new additions or variations. The old standbys of Saurians return, and they're generally pretty decent fun to chop their tails off for max damage and all that, and the goblins look great and sound great throughout their various incarnations, which is good since there are more goblins here than orcs in the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition. They're always launching across the landscape and knocking you off balance and failing to stop calling for reinforcements, even if you're hitting them for huge damage, so they're about as much fun as normal. I will say that the new enemies, like the lizards, aren't a welcome addition though. They're supposed to be vulnerable often in their tail and underbelly, and any attacks to the top half of their body will bounce off because of all the armor. Now this sounds simple enough to figure out, but the hitboxes are crazy off, as many times I bounced off into a stagger state even while spearing them right in the anus. So what became the sole joy of my playthrough was taking on the mid-level mini-bosses and often ones from the original game. The Cyclops act very much like they did in the original game, though I think they might have an extra move or two. They're classic Dragon's Dogma though, with a weak spot in the one eye that really throws them for a loop when you hit it, and they're easy to scale since they're tall but not too tall. They're often hiding out in the forest a lot and crash through the trees at you if they see you bellowing all the way. They're way scarier than before and just as much fun to fight, and it's because they let you do all the classic Dragon's Dogma stuff of having a definable personality and being fun to interact with and seeing their AI behaviors respond to you as you exploit their weak spots. The trolls still act like King Kong, picking up women and carrying them off or leaping off tall structures, and the new Minotaurs are really intimidating and fun to fight. They're ferocious, terrifying beasts that can clear out a whole team with their kicks. But all of these guys are much easier to stagger and feel like you're having an effect on than the other enemies. They're the simplest to engage, sure, but they're also the ones that don't just feel like they're giant slabs of health that aren't reacting to your attacks. Griffins do a little bit, but even after attacking their wings, I saw no indication of damage like I did when I attacked the drakes in the same way. Drakes are a special case here too because while their spellcasting is really intense and exciting to dodge, and they bellow out terrifying telepathic taunts to you through your Arisen connection, they have far too few weak spots and flail about too much to make targeting their weak spots fun or all that practical. They're incredible to watch, but they don't really feel very good to fight in my opinion, as they just take forever to whittle down. If you don't have a very specific setup like the goofy interaction between Formless Feint and Blade of Pyres, you're spending all your stamina and probably a lot of stamina potions to get to the one weak spot on their head and hack very slowly away if you're a spear hand. And that's if they haven't thrown you off already, which dragons are very prone to do. So yeah, most of my fun came from tackling the first tier of repeated mini-bosses. They're not tedious to fight and react very much to your input, making them feel a lot more like a game of give and take and risk and reward. I did notice a distinct lack of chimeras in this game, which I thought was really weird. That was kind of the flagship creature from the last game, and while you didn't fight them a ton, I'd say you'd probably get at least 5 or 6 fights out of them before the game was over. In DD2, I only found one single chimera that was out near some ruins, which is also the place where you show the elf how to shoot a human bow at one point. For those of you who have played the game and will know which one I'm talking about. If you know of any other places to fight chimeras, I would be glad to know, because he's so hard to kill in this game compared to the first one, and so rare. You really never get to see him if you, like me, had to leave the area because you just couldn't beat him at that point. And by the time I'd gotten powerful enough, I'd forgotten he even existed because you just never seemed to run into them, which is too bad. But regardless of all these kind of annoying back and forths with these enemies, what makes fights great regardless is when your pawns are kicking their spells into high gear and throwing tornadoes and blizzards around and all of that. But aside from this, and healing you a reasonable amount of the time they're asked to, pawns are incredibly disobedient partners in crime and really didn't help make the experience too much better. For some reason you don't know what pawns are your AI-controlled party members, one of which you make yourself just like you would your main character, and you rent out up to 2 others from the pool of pawns created by other players. They can be all sorts of different vocations and have different temperaments, like being more aggressive or more defensive, and they can catch you if you fall from great heights or even launch you into a high-reaching place like the back of a creature, and all sorts of cool stuff like that. The original pawns were also kind of like guileless, eternally loyal children who just repeated the same chipper advice ad nauseum like, "Goblins are weak to fire, and strength in numbers arisen," and they were quick to grab enemies and pin them down for you, or scale enemies to wear them down, or heal you if your health dipped even a little bit. They were a little overbearing at times with how often they talked, but man, they did their damn job. DD2's pawns just aren't up to snuff. Now, they are still chipper and will say some funny stuff like calling out their master as promiscuous by saying they get a lot of visitors to their bedchambers and it's never the same one.
The private quarters of one arisen I served had many a visitor, and rarely the same one.
But DD2's pawns really just say a lot of word salad that's usually neither helpful nor particularly funny, and that's when they're not criticizing you for running too fast or picking up too many items, often when you're not doing either one of those things. They went from being my beloved children to the nagging mother trope, and it just made me want to strangle them. Now, I will give Capcom credit for making them a lot more proactive about guiding you to rift stones or chests, or even taking the lead and guiding you to objectives they learned about in their original world, even way across the map. That's pretty cool, and a huge upgrade. I mean, they even saved my bacon a couple of times by reminding me of what to do next in a quest, including the example I used in the intro where they advised me to talk to a thief and get his opinion of where to find the jadeite orb. But in combat, they're far less reliable than normal. I almost never had to use the 4 commands of wait, help me, let's go, and come to me in the first game, but DD2 made me use the let's go and help me constantly in hopes that they'd stop doing something stupid. They still only obeyed about 60% of the time. I wondered if certain pawn dispositions made them resistant to commands, but when nearly every set of pawns had the same issue, I just had to chalk it up to the AI being faulty. Unlike the original game, where mages like the ever-faithful Rook would prioritize healing almost any time your health dipped below full, DD2's pawns rarely heal me without being asked first. Pawns also would get caught up in battle I wasn't interested in fighting and would refuse to leave even when I told them to come with or to help me, often getting downed in the process because they wouldn't get out of there and endangering me to the same fate if I went back to get them. Then if they did die, I then had to go out of my way to find a riftstone and revive them, or I'd be at a disadvantage at my party size. All because the pawns have a mind of their own. All told, pawns were just much less enjoyable to me this time around.
Is something troubling you, Master? I cannot imagine why anything should.
And that's about the long and short of my time with Dragon's Dogma 2. For all Itsuno's bluster about how this game was the original vision realized in all of its glory, I'm woefully underwhelmed by the final product. Itsuno made a smart comment about if you think travel is boring, that means your game is boring because it doesn't provide enough to do while you're traveling. Well, we're 2 games in now, and while the world in DD2 is more demanding in its terrain, more interesting to some degree, it's also got next to nothing to find in terms of landmarks or dungeons or loot, and we're still acting out the same MMO-light formula of kill 50 goblin gangs and occasionally run into a mini-boss. That's really our only entertainment between passable side quests and a main story that doesn't feel like it wants to exist. The pawns are often rock stupid, the controls are laggy, the camera's unequipped to handle intense fighting, and there's often way too much visual feedback ruining your ability to strategize. Once you get to a point where you're beating the hell out of everything, it's a rush, but this can only last so long because the combat's so simplistic. No matter what class I played, I always felt like I was just rushing to find an exploit to lean on and repeat over and over. All the emergent promise that you see in clips on YouTube is hardly something you can push the game to do a lot of the time. It just kind of happens or doesn't, and to be honest, it just didn't happen that often for me. But even if I felt the combat hadn't evolved much and the world design was kind of boring, I thought for sure we'd see an even greater emphasis placed on storytelling, at least in the main quest. The first game managed to get by with heart and great set pieces, extremely interesting and original lore, and one of the best twist endings I've ever seen in games. So expecting the story to improve from its strong foundation didn't seem like too much to ask. So DD2's strong opening seems like it's poised for greatness. But it goes off the rails quickly, and I mean quickly. It's really short and really half-baked, barely caring to introduce its characters before they do something monumental and then discarding plot lines at random, and its strange remixing of the lore is both a little confusing and unsatisfying in its execution. So let's go to Spoiler Town, population you and I, for what will be an unfortunate dance with potential that ends up going not much of anywhere. Okay, so first things first. Itsuno did say that Dragon's Dogma 2 would be experience-driven, not story-driven. And the inclusion of the somewhat hidden but exciting Medusa and Sphinx content is evidence of that. The Medusa, once defeated, can have her head used to petrify all sorts of enemies, and even solve a quest where you need to make a griffin sit still long enough so that an artist can sculpt it. The much-touted Sphinx from the trailers is remarkably well realized too, dangerous and mysterious in equal measure. Her riddles range from masterful to monstrously designed, though. One clever one lets you cheese out an escort mission where you would otherwise have to carry a fragile vase all the way across the world to a guy, unless you realize that you can just fairy stone the guy here to where the vase was given to you and solve the riddle that way. But then other riddles can require you to find one NPC in the entire game, or somehow know that when the Sphinx wants you to find its parent, it's actually meaning a pawn that only generates from one riftstone in the entire game and has the name Sphinx Father, Sphinx Mother, or Sphinx Parent. How in the fuck is that the solution, and how would you ever find this naturally? Don't get me started on how dumb it is that the Sphinx will fly away without dropping her loot if you defeat her while using the help of your pawns, instead of somehow knowing that you needed to tell them to wait so you could duel her one-on-one. The Sphinx, however great it is a microcosm of everything Dragon's Dogma is good and bad at. She's creatively realized, but pretty hardcore and arbitrary, and you can often miss out on some of the best parts of her because the game just wanted to be elusive and weird.
Perhaps you expected more, but I'm afraid that's that.
DD2's story is also executed unevenly. To understand how much they dropped the ball here, let's backtrack just a sec to the story of the original Dragon's Dogma. The first game started off with the dragon Grigori turning you into an Arisen, and your search to reclaim your heart has you meeting up with a kindred spirit in Duke Edmund Dragonsbane, the last person to defeat the dragon. You clean up his kingdom of monsters and the necromancer cult called Salvation that worships Grigori and sees him as a cleansing fire for the world. This story had several great set pieces, like a castle siege with 2 cyclops and tons of goblins, where you could even use a ballista to even the odds. The last boss fight is multi-staged and full of cool scripted sequences that really make Grigori feel like an imposing and complicated foe to engage, much less defeat. In addition, the story keeps getting narratively deeper too and more compelling. We actually find out that Edmund Dragonsbane didn't defeat the dragon those many years ago. He sacrificed his beloved in exchange for becoming the Duke and for a supernaturally long life, and he's been sacrificing his wives ever since. Grigori offers you the same choice to walk away and let him do his thing, sacrificing your love in the process. But you refuse, soundly defeating Grigori and thinking you've won. But you learn that the Arisen and the dragon are pawns in an endless cycle of death and rebirth for this world, and that his purpose was really just to strengthen your will to become the new ruler of this world, which is called a seneschal. You have to defeat the previous seneschal or risk becoming the dragon yourself. Thankfully, you defeat the seneschal and take its place, but choose to kill yourself with the only weapon that can hurt you, the Godsbane blade, ending the cycle before you've got another Arisen to take your place. Your body crashes to the earth and your pawn's consciousness is transferred into it so they can go about living as a human. This ending is fantastically creative and subverts the Dragon Slayer motif from classic fantasy in interesting ways. DD2 really does feel like it wants to add new dimensionality to these great ideas, but it ends up feeling like both a retread and a retcon that never quite reaches the potential that its subversion offers. Dragon's Dogma revealed to us that there are parallel worlds that all operate very similarly, but each have their own unique details, and the world of Vermund in DD2 is no different. In this world, the Arisen becomes the sovereign ruler of the land, and the current Queen Regent Disa is none too happy with your sudden challenge to her son Sven's legitimacy to the throne, so she has you cursed and sent to a slave labor camp. You break out with the help of an androgynous supernatural character named the Pathfinder, or the World Forge depending on whom you ask, and you meet up with the still loyal captain of the Royal Guard, Sir Brant, to go about reclaiming your throne. Using the aid of Brant's contacts within the palace, you sneak around a couple of times in extremely simple, almost unfailable stealth missions in which you retrieve sensitive information to reveal that Disa hired an ex-thief to take your place as the stand-in sovereign in Arisen, complete with a random chest wound he acquired back in the day, and even an item that lets him control pawns like an Arisen can called a Godsway. which is a device being masterminded by a character we only see briefly in notes and on-screen, whose name is Phases. We see this God's Way in action before we actually know what it is when we attempt to interrupt the coronation of the false arisen as the new sovereign. As we climb the steps to the throne room, we're repelled by a mysterious force that puts our pawn in excruciating pain and causes us to retreat. For a showdown that we've been anticipating as the culmination of all our detective work, this scene's really anticlimactic and feels like a whole gameplay sequence was cut. I wonder if this is the Capcom team taking the laziest or perhaps the path of least resistance to not have to craft a gameplay situation for this, or if this is just evidence that the team isn't actually as well off and free to do what they want as Itsuno claims. This won't be the last time we call into question either the team's commitment or resources, but let's press on. We're soon advised to speak with an old guy called the Dragon Forged, which means a former Arisen, a type of character that we saw in the first game. He tells us grand tales of how the brine, the red tentacles in all the bodies of water, prevents travel away from the mainland, and he also tells us how there's a giant statue out in the middle of the sea that's there to regulate the dragon and make sure he doesn't get out of control. He also tells us of a seneschal type character whose spirit resides in a castle beneath the sea that's just offshore. We soon meet this character once the castle mysteriously rises from the sea. This guy's name is Rothus, who left his post once he became aware that all of his great feats like defeating the dragon and founding Vermund were basically just preordained events, playing out on the world as a stage for the Pathfinder's pleasure. When Rothus realizes we're not in league with the Pathfinder, he conjures up the Godsbane blade and gives it to us, much like the Seneschal from the first game did, and tells us to go get it working again by going to Batal, the beastren homeland. And as we leave this area by activating an ancient elevator with the Godsbane blade, we see a giant statue seem to come to life. Uh-oh, could this be that great being beneath the sea that the Dragon Forge was talking about? Dun dun dun. But we'll find out more about this later. When we get to Batal, we see Phases entering by carriage just ahead of us, though our character doesn't know who he is yet. I mention this cutscene because it's one of 3 very small appearances we get of him before he just pops right to the forefront of the story as if we're supposed to know who he is or what he's doing. But anyway, we get to meet the wizard Ambrosius, who says the God's Way we've heard about is actually made of rift crystals, hence why it can control pawns just like the Arisen can do, just like we saw at the coronation. For some reason, we agree to work with this guy, even though the God's Way can't be a device used for anything good, and we entered this scene hearing him mutter under his breath about how he's literally working with Phases. But alas, this is yet another sign that the plot seems more interested in progressing to a preset end than making much sense. Ambrosius gets our Godsbane blade working if we gather some Worms-Life crystals from fallen drakes, which is one of only 2 action set pieces in the whole main story, and may just be a generic encounter with a drake, as any of them will drop the necessary crystals you need, though the story does prompt you to go to Dragon's Breath Tower for the most epic version of this event. But once this is done, Ambrosius says that he's going to take the repaired Godsbane blade to Lord Phases, which is bad news for us, I'd say. Then the Pathfinder shows up and mind controls him to give it to us instead. But then we just agree that we're going to take it to Phases anyway. What the fuck? What was the point of the Pathfinder intervening then? But march on we must in hopes that this story makes any sense soon. We soon see Phases opening a magical door to the shoreline and we follow him. What happens next is legitimately the first good main story quest in the entire game, and it's also the last. So remember that statue that came to life earlier that the Dragon Forge told us about? Well, this is Talos, the living colossus that's supposed to keep the dragon in check. Now, in my first playthrough, I didn't even hear the Dragon Forge's description of what the Talos Colossus was even supposed to do, so I was really in the dark why this statue just came out of the sea and what it was trying to do. Technically speaking, even after knowing about its function, I couldn't tell you what event the dragon is doing that it's even responding to here, but alas. Again, cool idea, but it seems like story moments are constructed in a vacuum without considering other parts of the story. But regardless, we get to have an absolutely epic, if a little time-consuming fight with this son of a gun. But if you get him down fast, he can actually be used like a mech later on to kill some dragons in the endgame, which is a really cool idea. But you'll have no reason to know or plan for that, so it's an unlikely occurrence that you'll see it, as you're being told to put down this giant thing, and it seems very destructive, and it's the only interesting thing that's happened in the story so far, so you're really obligated to just beat it down. While we're doing this, Phases tells his cohorts to not fear the giant, for he will be able to control the dragon when it appears. Somehow. Wait, there's a dragon appearing? Since when? Anyway, after defeating Talos, we follow him through the mines where the pawns are being used as slave labor, which you'll recognize as the place that we were exiled to at the beginning of the game. Then you'll ascend a stone staircase that looks very much like the one that led up to the Griffin in the first game before facing off against Phases' entourage. Once they're defeated, Phases reveals his plan to us. He's doing some kind of ritual to summon a plague dragon he calls the Royce Dragon, for some reason, which is much like the one we saw earlier in the Melv quest where we helped Ulrika, perhaps even the same one. He opines about how he's undoing the dragon's dogma by bringing this fake arisen and this fake dragon, but it's not really clear how he came into this knowledge or how putting together a Temu.com fake arisen and test tube dragon somehow will fool the cycle into stopping or changing in beneficial ways. We never quite find out how this was supposed to work either, because the real deal dragon drops from the heavens and scrunches the Royce dragon like a cockroach. So all this plotting to overthrow the arisen ended like a fart in the wind. Good job, Phases. What's so funny is that I expected that all this confusing stuff was coming to a head, that we were going to have a near-death experience with the dragon, and that would compel Phases to change his mind about how to go about achieving this end, and that we join forces and come up with a better plan. That would have made a much better story, and we get a bit of this in the end game, but after doing next to nothing of note in the story, we're already here at the point in a Dragon's Dogma game where we can choose whether to sacrifice our beloved or fight him, and trigger what is likely a very, subversive, exciting ending like the first game did, and I guess I got it, but in the weirdest way. Much like the first game, as the dragon dies, he tells you that some great will has formed the world into an endless cycle, where their battle and his death are preordained, and then he fades away after this haunting message, leaving you to sit on the throne that you've reclaimed. But off to the side is the Pathfinder, who obnoxiously asks, "Why are you pursuing me?" despite showing up at your coronation, unannounced for what can only be funny business. The Pathfinder reveals that if everything is governed by the Great Will, all would cease to exist if it was destroyed. But then the Pathfinder toys with you saying, well, if this doesn't feel right, you can always try again. Make a different choice than what you chose. And then the Pathfinder returns you to the back of the dragon before you chose to kill yourself and mess up the cycle. The dragon warns you here that despite your mutual desire to end this cycle, doing so will result in entropy and chaos. But he seems almost ready to be impressed by your will to resist, and so this time you climb up to his heart and kill him like the little bitch he is. No, wait, you kill yourself with the God's Bane blade? Okay, I didn't see that coming. Wait, why did you need to get down to his heart if you were going to kill yourself anyway? Okay. Well, regardless, doing this does exactly what the dragon and the Pathfinder told you it would do, and which is basically what happened in the first game as well when you stabbed yourself. Everything starts to come undone. The dragon and you fall to the earth, seemingly taken offline by your off-script maneuver, and the brine rises to consume you both. Then we hear the Pathfinder's warning to turn back from this path and return to the happy ending as the sovereign that you had procured when you killed the dragon the first time. And clearly something's up, as the Pathfinder is playing games with you, or maybe it's just poorly written, because the Pathfinder definitely doesn't want the cycle to end, but then they just gave you the ability to fuck the cycle up by letting you redo your actions. Oh, Capcom. So once we make our fateful decision to God's Bane ourselves, we awaken what is called the Unmoored World, a pocket dimension or a branching timeline, if you will, that we've created by refusing to comply with the Great Cycle. We get the Dragon's Dogma 2 title drop here as well, as if everything that's happened before has been building to this very moment. We discover that the brine is an extension of the Pathfinder's will, basically landlocking Vermund in its previous state. Here, though, the brine has ascended into the heavens and is acting like a great storm cloud, sending down several boss dragons to terrorize the landscape. You have 10 in-game days to evacuate all the major factions that you've come into contact with, and you can defeat these dragons as you like to extend the time before the brine storm consumes this world and erases it from existence. Okay, so no lie. The Unmoored World, in addition to being a really cool callback to when the God Hand showed up in Berserk post-Eclipse, is just a really cool idea and feels like brand new exciting territory. A timed endgame is really bold, and the idea of a last hurrah where we try to save everybody before the world ends sounds really heroic and epic and exciting, but it's unfortunately just not very special in practice. There's only one notable story encounter where we team up with Phases and get a sense that he's been trying to do the right thing all along and end the Great Cycle. Beyond that, though, all the other boss encounters are optional and unnecessary to add extra time to the endgame, because all that's required is just convincing a minimum of 3 of the 5 factions out there to get the good ending. And because you're not doing any battle, you're never in danger of dying or losing great amounts of health, therefore you don't need to rest to advance that 10-day timer. It's weird design to make the bosses optional here, though a merciful one for somebody like me who is kind of over the game at this point anyway. I did almost quit though after I died to a particularly annoying boss whose bottom half was entirely invincible, so I had to climb up very slowly to his brine top half and try to hit his weak spots. He killed me by throwing me to the ground, and I declined to use the wake stone to revive myself because I assumed I could just save my resources and reload my last save like I always did. But no, though the game doesn't give you any warning, unless you've rested at least once seconds in advance the day counter, you have to restart the entirety of the endgame from scratch. On New Game Plus, I realized that the game at least saves and lets you start over from any previous day that you've locked in, like day 2 or day 3 or what have you, which is nice. But man, not saving that first time because I thought I'd be able to preserve my limited rest proved disastrous. I lost over an hour and a half of progress. I ended up uninstalling the game right then and there and didn't come back until the next day when my rage had subsided, and I found some treats there. I ended up finishing the game and found a really cool worm boss elsewhere in the world that was a lot more fun to fight than the other one, but it is the only other boss type in the endgame, which is kinda lame. Aside from the bosses though, rallying the factions for the evacuation isn't nearly as interesting and tense as I'd hoped. You're basically doing what the initial parts of the main quest did, just running around doing menial errands and talking to people without any real set pieces. Now you could easily say that, well, the dragons are set pieces, and there's some cool stuff like you get to see the Dark Bishop reappear, the one from Dark Origin's Bitter Black Isle in the original game. But beyond these bosses who threaten to make you restart your otherwise harmless endgame run, and tidbits of crafted mission design with phases, there's no real narrative oversight or incentive here to keep you going, just lame errands to get people to join up with you. Hell, the only time I even rested was to resolve a glitch where the elves won't talk to you if you don't do their quest in the main game to restore their dying tree. All this lame back and forth with the factions doesn't even result in a good final boss fight or some truly epic send-off either. It's just this weird cutscene that plays underneath the credits like it's a done deal. Your pawn turns into a shadow dragon for some reason and flies you up to the back of the Great Red Dragon, and you're given maybe 30 seconds to a minute of actual control here, which just amounts to you running and avoiding some flames on the back of the dragon while the Pathfinder opines. The Pathfinder tells us that time was creating endless worlds that ended in oblivion. The Great Will sought to end this pointless destruction of worlds by granting purpose to those within it, creating the dragon, who would then in turn create an arisen when a suitable person was found, and this cycle would cease the world from ending somehow, so long as it remained unbroken. So not only do we reaffirm the dragon's role as we became familiar with it in the first game, but he's ostensibly the most important player, and the arisen is basically just his counterpoint, the one seeking to end the cycle. This is what's known as the dragon's dogma. The next set of lines had me rolling. The Pathfinder continues that everyone used to have a role just like the dragon and the arisen, that everyone played their part and had to in order to keep the cycle going. As the Pathfinder says, for a well-crafted tale has no excess, there must be a reason for each character's inclusion. Yet this means that should even one of these characters stray from their assigned role, the tale entire will unravel. And if it does, the world will end. Such is the choice you have made, Arisen. You have robbed all others of the chance to fulfill the roles they were assigned. This even includes the pawns. But boy oh boy is this ironic in terms of how DD2's narrative works in a real-world sense. Now the well-crafted tale here certainly isn't excessive per the Pathfinder's preference, but it actually needed to be more excessive, to have way more meat on its bones. It fails to justify all the Game of Thronesy build-up with the conspiracy to implant a false arisen, and then it becomes about overthrowing the cycle with a fake dragon that gets killed in like 2 seconds anyway. Phases shows up in about 15 seconds of cutscenes before he becomes the mover and the shaker behind the plot, and he really only gets one mission dedicated to him later on that even gets you in any way familiar with who he is and why he's doing what he's doing. And even then, we really never come to a conclusion as to how he figured this out, why this plan would in any way make the world bend to his will, how he thinks he's going to be able to control a dragon when he's got a god sway that only controls pawns, etc., etc. But anyway, back to the final cutscene. After the Pathfinder's monologue that ends with her telling us that we've even made the pawns masterless and consigned them to a fate of uselessness, our pawn actually flies up to tell us that, in fact, fuck you, Pathfinder.
'Tis clear to me now, Arisen. I am no longer a mere vessel. Your great will has imbued me with a lesser will of my own. Will is power. 'Tis the means to shape the world as one desires.
That shit cuts deep. I'm not gonna lie. That was good.
Their interference leaves you with an opening to strike the fatal blow to the dragon, ending the cycle once and for all. Somehow, the Pathfinder says they won't be around to see the new world that arises. Sick. Now, this all kind of feels like the original game's ending, where your pawn becomes more human and self-possessed, and where you strike down yourself or the dragon as an avatar of the status quo and break the world of its awful cycle. It is a little confusing that killing the dragon is what makes the cycle end, when the only thing that made the cycle end in the last game was that you stabbed yourself before there was a new arisen to take your place. I don't know, the rules seem like they're kind of being made up as we go along. But one cool thing that happens in DD2's ending is the old Dragonforged you met on the shore gets into his sailboat and sets out for new lands. The brine nowhere to be found any longer, as the Pathfinder's influence on this world is gone. And all this happens while we get to see what is essentially Capcom's power ballad answer to a Disney song. Now, I grew up watching all the old Disney cartoon classics, so I love any songs that sound like this, and I gotta say, this one hit me in the feels. It's just got a vibe to it. But what kept pulling me out of the emotionality of the song was this chuckle in my throat about how emotionally unearned it is because of how disjointed, short, and anticlimactic the story was that we just experienced. It doesn't feel like we've been on the emotional journey that the song implies that we have been. So yeah, man, the story is just rushed. There's so very little of note that you get to do during the campaign, and the things that do happen don't quite make any lore sense. I mean, the revelation as to what the brine really is pretty exciting. The giant being there as a last gasp measure from the world to kind of keep the dragon in line is a really good idea, as is the unmoored world. But it's just like the details and how these things play out never quite do these concepts justice. I just don't get it. Itsuno seems so pleased with his product, and I'm happy that people are really enjoying it, but I'm incredulous as to why, at least compared to the promise of the original game. Itsuno complained that there was so much cut from his original vision with Dragon's Dogma, including going to the moon as a dungeon. That was supposed to account for some of the clunkiness of that game, from its janky character models, lip-syncing, repetitiveness, lack of real dungeons or loot, and the emptiness of the map. But Dragon's Dogma 2 repeats nearly every single mistake with far more budget and time, and no indication from Itsuno that Capcom hampered his vision in any way this time. Some side quests are clever, but many are fairly boilerplate and a pain in the ass to solve, as you're often told to wait days and days for steps to advance, or given no clue where your objective is. The dialogue's fine, but delivered so stiffly from a visual perspective that it feels cheap and phoned in. Your character controls a little better, and sometimes the game looks pretty beautiful, but it's stretched far too thin, and ends up repeating too many assets eventually, and doesn't have any good loot worth looking for, or at least enough of interest to seek out, so the game becomes an endless stream of trash mobs punctuated by some often decent mini-boss fights that become the only real highlight of the game. And the worst part is that the story shows so much promise with its ideas, and then you're barely inconvenienced by the world ending, and then you're given a lame Flora's lava sequence inside of a cutscene to account for the final reward for all of your trouble. It's just weird, man. Almost everything feels too tidy, too concise, too brief, or too samey in its structure, without enough innovation to really make this series feel much deeper or more alive than before. There's also a distinct lack of excitement and actual set pieces outside of the admittedly cool Talos boss fight and the brine dragons in the endgame. I'm loath to say Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bad game. It's certainly not. It has its moments, but it's not a very good sequel. Sure, it improves game feel and fast travel, but it feels like a remake or a redo, and over a decade out, and with all the time and money afforded this project compared to the first one, this really does feel like the least memorable way that the series could have been resurrected. Dragon's Dogma 2 was deeply disappointing, and that doesn't feel good to say. I'd hope that I couldn't go wrong with Dragon's Dogma, but I guess they can't all be masterworks, can they?
A masterworks all, you can't go wrong. Come again.
Thanks for watching. And a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by subscribing to my Patreon. I have to thank Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Hiak Show, and M for their contributions, and a special thanks to the Nth Review and James Wyatt for subscribing to my Patreon's highest tier. If you'd like to be part of the reason this channel gets bigger and better, feel free to go over to patreon.com/high-functioning-medium, or you can become a YouTube channel member, or if you prefer, you can donate at Ko-fi. Also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to contribute to the channel with no cost to you. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.